Something extraordinary is happening within Trump's inner circle right now, and it's not coming from external pressure or opposition attacks. 1 minute ago, reports emerged that Trump's closest allies are fracturing in a crisis that nobody anticipated, splitting into warring factions over a decision that threatens to tear apart the coalition that has sustained Trump through impeachments, indictments, and endless controversies. And this isn't just another disagreement about campaign strategy or policy positions that can be smoothed over with compromise and negotiation. This is a fundamental rupture between groups who have different visions for Trump's political future, different assessments of what his legal jeopardy means for the movement, and different levels of willingness to continue defending positions that are becoming increasingly untenable. Stay until the end, because what's unfolding here goes far beyond typical political infighting or the kind of palace intrigue that happens in every campaign. This is a stress test of whether Trump's coalition can survive when faced with choices that force his allies to prioritize either loyalty to Trump personally or survival of the broader political movement he represents. And if you want to understand why longtime Trump defenders are suddenly at each other's throats, and why this fracture could reshape Republican politics heading into 2024, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss analysis of the internal crises that determine political outcomes. So imagine this scene. Late yesterday evening in conference rooms and private residences across Washington and Mar-a-Lago, Trump's most loyal advisors, the people who have defended him through every scandal and crisis, engaged in heated arguments about how to respond to a development that has exposed fundamental disagreements about strategy, about risk tolerance, and about whether Trump's interests are still aligned with the movement's interests. And these aren't arguments between Trump loyalists and establishment Republicans. This is internal warfare among people who have been completely committed to Trump, who have sacrificed relationships and reputations to support him, and who now find themselves on opposite sides of an existential question. And the immediate trigger for this fracture isn't entirely clear from public reporting, but multiple sources describe it as related to Trump's legal strategy in one of his major criminal cases, specifically about whether Trump should take certain actions that his lawyers believe might help him personally, but that his political advisors warn could be catastrophic for Republican electoral prospects in 2024. And that tension between Trump's personal legal interests and the political movement's electoral interests has been building for months. But something happened in the past 24 hours that brought it to a head, that forced people to choose sides, and that revealed just how deep the divisions within Trump's circle actually run. And the fracture is playing out on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the split between lawyers focused on Trump's legal defense and political operatives focused on winning elections. There's the divide between MAGA true believers who think Trump can do no wrong and more pragmatic Republicans who worry that his legal troubles are becoming unsustainable. And there's the conflict between advisors who want Trump to fight every legal battle regardless of political cost, and those who want him to make strategic retreats to preserve his viability as a candidate. Now, to understand why Trump's allies are fracturing in this crisis, you need to understand the underlying tensions that have been building within his coalition for years, because this isn't a sudden rupture caused by one event. It's the culmination of structural problems that have been papered over through personal loyalty and political success, but that were always going to surface eventually. And the first fundamental tension is between Trump as a person and Trumpism as a movement. Trump's most devoted personal loyalists believe that the movement is inseparable from Trump himself, that his unique ability to connect with voters is what makes the entire project viable, and that protecting Trump personally must always be the top priority. But others in the coalition believe that Trumpism, the policy agenda, and the political coalition Trump assembled is bigger than any individual, and that if Trump's personal troubles threaten the movement's success, the movement needs to find ways to survive without being completely dependent on him. And for years, Trump's political success made this tension irrelevant. When he was winning, nobody had to choose between Trump personally and the movement. But now, with Trump facing multiple criminal trials, with his approval ratings stuck in negative territory, with polls suggesting he'd lose a general election rematch, some allies are starting to question whether blind loyalty to Trump personally is still serving the movement's interests. And the second tension is between legal strategy and political strategy. Trump's criminal defense lawyers are focused on winning cases or at least delaying trials past the election. Their job is to protect Trump from conviction, and they're willing to pursue strategies that might be politically damaging if those strategies offer the best chance of legal victory. But Trump's political advisors are focused on winning the 2024 election. Their job is to maintain Trump's viability as a candidate, and sometimes what's good legal strategy is terrible political strategy. And the third tension is about risk tolerance and time horizons. Some Trump allies are all in for the long term. They believe Trump represents a historic realignment, that his movement will reshape the Republican Party for a generation, and that short-term setbacks, including potential convictions, are worth enduring. Other allies are more focused on winning in 2024. They see Trump as the best vehicle for achieving policy objectives in the near term, but they're less committed to Trump personally and more willing to cut losses if his chances evaporate. Now let's examine the specific crisis that's triggering this fracture, because understanding what actually happened is essential to grasping why the reaction has been so intense. The crisis centers on a decision Trump needs to make about one of his criminal cases, specifically about whether to testify at trial. Trump's criminal defense lawyers have apparently given him contradictory advice. Some believe that Trump's testimony would be disastrous because prosecutors would use cross-examination to introduce evidence about other alleged crimes, to highlight inconsistencies in his statements, and to expose his credibility issues to a jury. They're strongly recommending that Trump exercise his Fifth Amendment right not to testify, that he rely on his lawyers to present the defense, and that he avoid putting himself in a position where he could commit perjury. But other lawyers in Trump's circle, particularly those who are more politically oriented, are arguing that refusing to testify would be politically catastrophic. They point to polling showing that voters view refusal to testify as evidence of guilt. They argue that Trump's entire political brand is based on being a fighter who doesn't back down, and that taking the fifth would look like cowardice. And they believe that Trump's ability to connect with people could actually be an asset at trial. And Trump's political advisors are split on similar lines. Some believe that the trial itself is going to dominate the campaign, and that Trump needs to use it as a platform to prosecute his case politically. They want Trump to be aggressive, to turn the courtroom into theater, and to use every moment to reinforce his persecution narrative. Other political advisors believe that the trial is a disaster that needs to be minimized, that every day Trump spends in a courtroom is a day he's not campaigning, and that the best strategy is to get through the trial as quickly and quietly as possible. And what brought this to a boil was apparently a meeting where Trump's lawyers presented him with a final recommendation about trial strategy, and different factions who were present left with completely different interpretations of what was decided and whether the legal team or the political team would have final say. And within hours, different camps were leaking to reporters, were backgrounding journalists with competing narratives, and were publicly criticizing each other's positions. Trump's most legally oriented advisors were suggesting that political operatives don't understand the severity of the legal jeopardy. Political operatives were suggesting that lawyers are too cautious and don't understand Trump's unique political strengths. Now let's examine the specific factions that are emerging from this crisis. First, there's what we might call the true believers, people who are loyal to Trump personally above all else. These are figures like Stephen Miller and others who view Trump as a historic figure whose mission transcends normal political calculations. They believe Trump should testify, should fight every legal battle as aggressively as possible, should never compromise. And they view anyone who suggests that Trump should temper his approach as traitors. This faction tends to be younger, more ideological, and more focused on long-term transformation than on winning any particular election. They're true believers in Trump's populist nationalist vision, and they're willing to accept short-term losses, including potential convictions, if those setbacks are part of a longer struggle. Second, there's the political pragmatists, experienced Republican operatives who aligned with Trump because he won elections. These are figures like campaign managers who have deep experience in Republican campaigns and who understand swing state dynamics. They're increasingly concerned that Trump's legal troubles and his aggressive response to them are making him unelectable. They want Trump to moderate his approach, to avoid unnecessary controversies, and to focus ruthlessly on swing state voters. Third, there's the legal team, which itself is divided. Some of Trump's lawyers are movement lawyers who view representing Trump as part of a broader ideological mission. Others are more traditional criminal defense attorneys focused purely on the legal case and who are increasingly alarmed at how political considerations are interfering with sound legal strategy. And fourth, there's a small but growing group of Trump allies who are quietly exploring exit strategies. These are people who remain publicly supportive, but who are privately preparing for the possibility that Trump becomes unviable, who are positioning themselves to survive in a post-Trump Republican Party. This faction is the most dangerous to Trump because their quiet defection signals to other Republicans that it might be safe to create distance. Now let's talk about how this internal fracture is manifesting publicly. You can see it most clearly in how different Trump allies are responding to questions about his legal strategy. When asked whether Trump should testify, some loyalists give full-throated endorsements expressing complete confidence, but other Trump supporters give more hedged responses, suggesting that the decision should be left to his legal team, and those different responses signal that there's no unified position. And the fracture is visible in anonymous leaking to reporters. You're seeing stories based on sources close to Trump's legal team criticizing the political operation, and you're seeing other stories based on political advisors questioning whether the lawyers understand the political implications. And while all of these sources claim to be acting in Trump's best interests, the fact that they're publicly attacking each other reveals the dysfunction. The fracture is also playing out on social media and in conservative media appearances. Some Trump allies are arguing that Trump should take maximally aggressive positions. Others are subtly suggesting that Trump needs to be more strategic. And conservative media figures themselves are dividing along similar lines, and you're seeing the fracture affect Trump's relationship with other Republican politicians. Some remain completely loyal, but others are creating subtle distance, declining to comment on his legal strategy, focusing their statements on policy issues rather than Trump personally. And that erosion of universal Republican support signals that some elected officials are preparing for a future where they might need to distance themselves more overtly. Now let's examine what this fracture means for the 2024 election. For Trump's primary campaign, this creates openings for rivals like Ron DeSantis, who can argue that Trump's operation is chaotic and dysfunctional. They can point to the internal warfare as evidence that Trump can't build effective teams, that his need for personal loyalty creates environments where people are afraid to give honest advice, and that his legal troubles are consuming resources and attention. For a potential general election, this fracture is even more damaging. Independent voters and moderate Republicans are watching Trump's inner circle implode and concluding that his operation isn't ready for the presidency. They're seeing that his legal jeopardy is creating impossible conflicts between his personal interests and his political viability. And the fracture is affecting down-ballot races because Republican candidates in swing districts need to decide how closely to align themselves with Trump. And when Trump's own inner circle is sending mixed signals, it makes those decisions even harder. And there are also implications for Trump's ability to govern if he does win, because the presidency requires building and managing teams, navigating conflicts between different advisors, and making difficult decisions. And if Trump can't maintain unity during a campaign when everyone should be aligned, how could he possibly manage the far more complex task of governing? And perhaps most fundamentally, this fracture reveals that Trump's coalition was always more fragile than it appeared. When he was winning, everyone could maintain the fiction that they were all on the same team. But under stress, the underlying tensions surface and the coalition starts to fall apart. Now let's consider how this fracture fits into a broader pattern of how Trump manages relationships, because this isn't the first time Trump's inner circle has experienced dramatic turnover and internal conflict. Throughout his business career, his first presidency, and his post-presidential operation, Trump has consistently created environments where advisors are in constant competition, where loyalists vie for his favor, and where the lack of clear organizational structure forces everyone to constantly jockey for position. And for Trump personally, this approach has advantages. It means no single advisor becomes powerful enough to constrain him. It creates multiple sources of information and advice, and it allows him to play factions against each other to maintain control. But the disadvantages are becoming increasingly apparent. Organizations that operate through constant internal warfare are unstable. Talented people eventually leave, and when crises emerge that require unity, the dysfunction becomes a liability. And what's different about this current fracture is that the stakes are higher than they've ever been. Trump is facing potential imprisonment, political defeat, and the possible collapse of his entire movement. And the fracture within his circle isn't about minor policy differences, it's about fundamental questions of survival. So where does this leave us? What should we expect as this fracture continues to develop? Well, in the immediate term, expect the internal warfare to intensify before it resolves. Different factions will continue leaking to media, will continue publicly criticizing each other, and will continue competing for Trump's favor. And that dysfunction will be visible to voters, to donors, and to Republican politicians. Expect Trump himself to eventually intervene and impose some kind of resolution, either by siding with one faction or by purging people he views as disloyal, because Trump's management style allows competition, but ultimately requires that everyone accept his final decisions. So at some point he'll decide how he wants to handle his trial strategy, and people who can't get on board will be pushed out. But the damage from this public fracture will persist. The visible internal warfare has revealed divisions that can't be hidden. It's created doubt about whether Trump's operation can function effectively, and it's given permission to Republican politicians and voters who were looking for reasons to create distance. And longer term, this fracture is a preview of tensions that will continue plaguing Trump throughout 2024. The conflict between his legal interests and his political viability isn't going away. The underlying disagreements can't be permanently resolved because they reflect genuinely incompatible goals. If Trump wins the nomination, expect continuing internal turmoil as legal cases reach trials. Expect more advisors to leave or be forced out, and expect continuing cycles of internal warfare that distract from the campaign. If Trump loses the nomination, this fracture will likely accelerate as different factions blame each other for the defeat and compete to define Trump's legacy and the future of his movement. What this crisis reveals is that Trump's coalition was always more fragile than it appeared, held together by political success and personal loyalty, but lacking the institutional structures that allow political movements to survive setbacks. And when those holding forces weaken, the coalition starts to fragment. So stay informed as this develops. Understand that what looks like simple campaign dysfunction is actually revealing fundamental questions about whether Trump's political movement can survive the stress tests it's now facing. And if you want analysis that goes beyond the surface drama, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on, because these are the moments when political coalitions prove whether they're built to last or whether they were only ever held together by one person's charisma. And we're watching in real time as Trump's inner circle fractures in ways that will determine not just his fate, but the fate of the movement he created. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one as this unprecedented crisis within Trump's coalition continues to unfold.